Hello everyone, this is Group 6. Our assignment for this week was to create a short presentation regarding Chapters 6 and 7 in our text, A New History of Social Welfare. We were responsible for covering the material from pages 183 to 208. Here is our presentation entitled Women's Movement in the 1800s to True Womanhood. We hope you enjoy it. This section of Chapter 6 covered the 19th century with regards to women, both how they were perceived as well as their struggle for equality. During this time, two major issues presented themselves with regards to women. These issues were abolition and suffrage. Abolition was concerned with the eradication of slavery, whereas suffrage was concerned with the suppression of women, the economic consequences of Southern slavery, and the exploitation of Northern workers. Before the mid-1800s, women were little more than property. They were financially dependent on their husbands, and the main focus of a proper woman was her home and family. The status of a woman during this time could be likened to slavery in terms of control, lack of recognition, and limited resources or options. The mid-1800s saw the beginnings of the women's movement and changes in laws. In 1848, the state of New York enacted a law enabling women to keep the property they had before marriage. Several other states followed suit. While this law benefited women, its source was not that humanitarian. This law was designed not for women's rights, but so families would not lose inherited land as their women married off. Later, in 1860, New York State enacted more laws for women. Married women were given the right to make contracts without their husbands if the husband was incompetent, and additionally, they were guaranteed inheritance rights after the death of their spouses. While the abolitionist movement was closely tied to the suffragist movement before the Civil War, the passage of the 14th Amendment saw the beginning of a bitter split. This amendment, which gave all men the right to vote, divided the ways in which suffragist activists espoused change. For those like Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, and Frederick Douglass, a softer approach was promoted. The first of these two individuals worked for the American Women's Suffrage Association to try to make changes from within the system. This method, however, was not for activists like Hattie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who espoused more radical means. Creating the National Women's Suffrage Association, they worked for causes such as marriage equality, free love, labor unions, and civil rights for prostitutes. More controversial was this group's espousal of educated suffrage, the idea that voting rights could be awarded based on educational status versus sex. There were three important social welfare movements during the latter part of the 19th century. These were the Charity Organization Society movement, the Settlement House movement, and the Child Saving movement. The Charity Organization Society movement was based on socio-religious ideals such as those related to the ethics of hard work. It blamed the poor for their condition. This movement was aimed more towards individual casework, and from a society perspective, it sought to limit influences from Southern and Eastern European immigrants. The second major movement was the Settlement House movement. This movement was also based on socio-religious ideals, but it was aimed more towards social action and reform through organizing at a grassroots level. The third movement was the Child Saving movement. As its name implies, this movement focused on the needs of children, and it intersected with the other two movements. The Charity Organization Society intersected with this movement by removing children and placing them in environments which held its ideals, while the Settlement House movement intersected with this movement by taking on such children's issues as education, labor laws, and aid. The elite classes were the ones who created and fostered the beginnings of the welfare state, partially to help underprivileged, but also partially to keep them from causing trouble. There are some interesting points about the beginnings of this movement. First, even though women were instrumental in creating and staffing these programs, they were under the auspices of the white male. Also, minority groups such as African Americans, Asians, and Native Americans were often excluded from these programs. The Civil War saw a great need for charitable services. Organizations were created to deal with the injured and ill, sanitary conditions, and the families of those affected by war. Two of note were the American Red Cross, which took care of the injured and ill and searched for the missing, and the Women's Central Association of Relief, later the U.S. Sanitary Commission. These two organizations saw to just about every need of the war, setting up and inspecting camps and hospitals, constructing buildings, as well as providing food and aid to soldiers and their families. After the Battle of Port Royal, 10,000 slaves were left homeless and without resources. Lincoln authorized aid for them through two volunteer agencies, the National Freedmen's Relief Association and the Boston Education Commission. When the war was over, the need was even greater, and with the change in federal power structure, the move towards a federal welfare state began. first federally mandated program was the Freedmen's Bureau. This agency, created in 1865, assisted those displaced by the war. It was a comprehensive agency which provided food, clothing, shelter, counseling, and employment services to all those in need. As it worked with other volunteer organizations, it became a model for public and private cooperation in the delivery of services to individuals. Over the subsequent 25 years, the federal government instituted programs which assisted veterans as well. While the federal government provided programs and benefits for Union soldiers, the southern states were primarily responsible for taking care of their Confederate veterans. The post-war period saw 3 new amendments to the Constitution. The first was the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. The second was the 14th Amendment, which granted freed slaves due process and rescinded the 3/5 clause. The third amendment added was that of the 15th. This granted universal suffrage to men of African descent. Another important piece of post-war legislation was the Interstate Commerce Act. Although its success was questionable, this act tried to limit monopolies through the control of railroad barons. The post-war economy, which boomed due to rebuilding of the South and migration to the West, brought more wealth to elite industrialists. Their workers, immigrants, African Americans, women, and children saw none of these profits, though. When the depressions of 1873 and 1893 hit, the workers suffered greatly. Hundreds of thousands were without work, making the poor poorer and creating a new category of individual, the tramp. Unemployed men traversing the country looking for work, handouts, and shelter. Labor unions began to gain strength after the war. Several unions were formed in the 1880s and 1890s. Among them, National Labor Council, Colored Farmers Alliance, the Knights of Labor, and the Working Women's Protective Union. While all of these organizations sought to secure rights and improve their working conditions, not all were in favor of equal rights. Many did not include minorities or women. One, in particular, the American Federation of Labor, actually sought to remove women from the workforce. From 1870 to 1900, the United States saw a great increase in its population. Immigration and African American migration were 2 major reasons behind this population growth. While the post-war economic boom welcomed this labor source, new cultures, languages, and religions all came together with their resultant conflicts. Because they were an especially cheap source of labor, the Chinese were encouraged to immigrate during the early parts of the 19th century up until the Civil War. In fact, during the 1870s, the Chinese made up to 25% of wage laborers in California. With them came traditions that benefited labor, trade guilds, clubs, etc. After the war, however, the Chinese were seen as a threat to the white laborers. Not only were they subjected to violence by whites, laws were passed to prohibit their rights and halt their immigration. During westward expansion, resources such as the bison were decimated, and as a result, the Native American population suffered greatly. In 1871, deciding that it was easier to feed these Native Americans than to kill them, the federal government declared Native Americans as wards of the government. As part of this, the Allotment Act of 1887 was passed. This act divided up Native American land between freehold farmers. Although it was supposed to benefit Native Americans, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was responsible for administering this, was corrupt. Because of this, many were cheated and 90,000 Native Americans received nothing. This bureau was also responsible for overseeing programs designed to instill its Eurocentric, androcentric, and Protestant ideals. Backlash from Native Americans led to the creation of a new Native American religion, the Ghost Dance. This religion preached the reunification of living and dead Native Americans and eventual disappearance of the white man. It also espoused active resistance. The federal government responded quickly and violently to this backlash, killing many Native Americans. Emancipation of the slaves caused competition for jobs with whites, especially in the South. The 14th and 15th Amendments gave full citizenship rights to black men, and they began to utilize them immediately. Using their right to vote, they began to become a voice in society. They held offices such as governor, legislator, judge, and treasurer. Their increase in power base became a major threat to the white establishment. The response of this establishment to this threat was quick and severe. The KKK was formed in 1867, and atrocities towards African Americans became rampant. After the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, the white response to this threat became officially state-sanctioned. Bowing to the pressure of this contested election, the federal government agreed to a Southern demand for home rule. This agreement by the federal government paved the way for black codes and Jim Crow laws, which reversed most of the gains African American men had made after the war. While they were no longer slaves, their rights and the treatment of African American men was hardly better. This was the beginning of official segregation. The last decade of the 19th century saw a rise in the cult of true womanhood. The concepts of true womanhood were based on the idea that, due to their lack of libido, women were more spiritually evolved than men. As part of this high spiritual evolvement, women possessed the unique qualities of compassion, nurture, and morality. This had far-reaching consequences for women and their rights. Due to these inherent characteristics, women were best suited to staying at home and taking care of their families. If they had to work, however, it should be only in areas where they could make the best of their natural qualities, by attacking immorality and uncleanliness. The clubs, organization, and institutions formed by women at this time reflect this ideal. Women's issues, and especially their status in society, were tied to their sexuality. Upper-class women were considered to be pure, sexless, and excelled at being wives and mothers. If they worked, it was for the benefit of society. They were teachers, nurses, or performed charity work. On the other hand, lower-class women were forced to work in other environments such as factories, sweatshops, and in occupations such as maids were considered to have dirty jobs and therefore be immoral. And, by the nature of this behavior, it was okay to exploit them. As birth rates declined, so did women's choices regarding contraception. Laws prohibiting contraception and abortion were enacted, not taking into consideration the true causes of this low birth rate. This low birth rate was blamed on contraception and also by prostitutes spreading venereal disease. However, there is no acknowledgement of the husbands who were obviously bringing it home to their wives. Before the Seneca Convention of 1848, women had virtually no rights. They could not vote or practice professionally as attorneys, doctors, or pastors. All monies that they made, as well as all of their property, belonged to their husbands, and, in cases of divorce, the husband was favored, especially with regards to custody of the children. After the Seneca Convention, and before the Civil War, some states began to enact laws that would change the status of women in society. During the Civil War, women moved into the labor force out of necessity. After the war, however, attitudes changed, and proper women were only seen as fit for jobs that were in line with their pure nature. While the suffragist and abolitionist movements shared a common bond before the Civil War, it did not last. Once the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed and rights were established for African American men, the two groups emerged: those who favored a soft approach to women's rights and those who favored a more radical approach. The change in federal powers after the Civil War began the move towards a welfare state. The first federally mandated agency was the Freedmen's Bureau, and it set the standard for private and public cooperation for the good of society. Rights that were given by way of the 14th and 15th Amendments were effectively stripped during later years. Emancipation of the slaves caused competition for jobs with whites in the South. This caused a backlash in which most of the rights given to African American men were stripped away. While it is relatively easy to think of slavery as a history of oppression in the United States, this is a history that also includes the plights of women, Native American, and immigrants. While slavery may have been the most overt form, these groups have a mutual bond of oppression that exists to this day. Since the upper-class white man possessed all of the power in 19th century America, he must have played some part in social change. What did this look like? Was he actively involved, or did he play a more passive role by not interfering with societal trends? Conflict and groupthink are two theories that come into mind when looking at the struggles and behaviors of the different classes during this time period. What specific other theories can be applied to the macro behavior of this time period? What are some of the lessons we can take from this period in history? And how can we apply them to the future? Social work, as we know it today, can see its foundation in many of the events which occurred during the 19th century. This is a two-way street, however, as it can be said that history itself has been influenced by the values and ethics of those first social workers. These individuals who fought for social justice, whether to abolish slavery, for women's suffrage, or for equal rights for all, have made a contribution by shaping the events which have now become our history. By studying and analyzing the history of social work, one can garner an understanding of the attitudes and behaviors of populations in light of their time and circumstances. Possessing this understanding can assist us in gaining insight when evaluating current times and circumstances. Learning that social work's history is the history of the elite classes brings into perspective the concept that bias is a never-ending threat to competent practice. Because of this, constant self-reflection is a necessity. It ensures that as little bias as possible is affecting our work. This concludes our assignment for the week regarding chapters 6 and 7 of our text, which covered the period Women's Movement in the 1800s to True Womanhood. We hope you enjoyed it.